You've probably been told this your entire life, by parents, by mates, by basically every finance article you've ever skimmed. Renting is dead money. Buying is the smart move. Get on the property ladder as early as you possibly can, or risk being priced out forever. I want you to sit with that idea for a second, because in a moment I'm going to show you data released just a couple of weeks ago that genuinely challenges it. Right now, in every single capital city in this country, renting is actually cheaper than buying, not slightly cheaper. In some cities, it's not even close. And in Sydney specifically, the gap is so large that when I first read the numbers, I genuinely had to double check I wasn't misreading a decimal point. So today, I want to properly unpack this. Where did this belief actually come from? What does the current data really say? And more importantly, is this myth actually completely wrong? Or is the real story a bit more complicated than that? Stick around, because the answer isn't as simple as pick a side, and I think the nuance here matters more than the headline number does. Hey guys, Daniel here. Welcome back to Daniel Reports. If you're new here, this is where I break down money, property, and the economy in Australia in plain English without the bias one way or the other. And I'll be honest, this topic is a personal one for a lot of people, myself included, because so much of how we were raised to think about money runs straight through this exact debate. If that's the kind of honest, no agenda breakdown you're after, do me a favor, hit subscribe, tap that like button. Genuinely takes 2 seconds, and it helps this channel keep growing. All right, let's dig into where this belief actually came from. Let's start with the myth itself, because I think it's worth actually naming it properly before we pull it apart. The belief goes something like this. Rent is money you'll never see again, it just disappears every month. But a mortgage repayment builds you equity, so even though it might cost more, you're paying yourself, not a landlord. This idea has been passed down for generations in Australia, almost like a cultural rule rather than a financial calculation. Buying a home became tied up with the whole idea of the Australian dream, success, stability, making it as an adult. Here's the thing though, that belief was built in a completely different interest rate environment, and it's rarely been properly stress tested against what's actually happening in the market right now. So let's actually test it. Quick pause here, because I know some of you are already thinking, all right, Daniel, everyone knows buying builds wealth long term. What's actually new here? Stick with me, because the current numbers are genuinely surprising, even if you think you already know this space. New analysis released just a couple of weeks ago found that renting is now cheaper than buying in every single Australian capital city, when you're talking about houses specifically. Let's start with Sydney, because it's the most dramatic example by far. The median house price in Sydney is sitting at just over $1.6 million. Based on a 20% deposit, that works out to a mortgage repayment of roughly $7,700 a month. The median rent for that same type of property? Around $3,735 a month. Read that again. Buyers are paying roughly double what renters are paying, for essentially the same roof over their head. And Sydney isn't even alone here. Brisbane shows a 75% premium for buying over renting. Canberra sits at 55%. Here's the part that actually stopped me while researching this. This modelling was based on a 6% interest rate assumption. The Reserve Bank's actual cash rate right now sits at 4.35% after 3 hikes this year, which means the real gap between what buyers and renters are paying could genuinely be even bigger than what these numbers show. My honest take on this. If you grew up hearing that renting is throwing money away and buying is automatically the financially smarter move, this data alone should make you pause, because right now, in a lot of this country, the math simply doesn't support that as a blanket rule anymore. So why is this actually happening right now? Because it's worth understanding the mechanics, not just the headline number. The Reserve Bank hiked interest rates 3 separate times this year, largely in response to inflation being pushed up by conflict overseas and rising oil prices. Every one of those hikes made mortgage repayments more expensive, without doing anything at all to bring house prices down in most areas. There was actually a report from the Real Estate Institute of Australia that found the average home loan is now eating up just over half, 50.8% of the typical family's income. Here's how I'd explain that gap to a mate. Rates went up, prices largely stayed high. And the space between what a mortgage costs and what rent costs simply got wider and wider, almost like 2 lines on a graph that used to sit close together, slowly pulling apart. Now, here's where I want to be genuinely fair, because I don't think this video does its job properly if I just tell you one side of this story and leave it there. This isn't universally true everywhere. In certain specific markets, inner Melbourne units, Darwin and Canberra units specifically, buying is actually still working out cheaper month to month than renting the same property. So the honest, nuanced version of this isn't renting always wins or buying always wins. It's that the old blanket rule, buying is basically always the smarter financial move no matter where you are, simply doesn't hold up the way it used to. Location and property type genuinely change this calculation completely, and treating it as one universal truth is exactly where this myth falls apart. Now let's talk about the part of this that genuinely concerns me, because I think it's the most important piece of the whole discussion. Recent research found that around 45% of Australian renters are already struggling to afford their rent as it is. But here's the twist that I think gets missed constantly. A lot of people who are financially stretched don't actually choose to keep renting and wait. They push themselves into buying instead, specifically because they've internalized this idea that renting is a failure or a waste or something to escape as fast as possible. And in an environment like this one, where mortgage repayments are already eating up half of a typical family's income, that fear-driven decision can push someone into genuine mortgage stress purely because they were trying to avoid a myth, rather than actually running their own numbers. Here's a daily life way to think about this. It's a bit like rushing to buy the biggest meal on the menu because you're worried about looking cheap in front of your mates, and then realizing halfway through you genuinely can't finish it, and it's sitting heavy for the rest of the night. Sometimes the smaller, smarter choice gets skipped purely because of how it looks, not because of what actually fits. Let's zoom out for a second, because Australia isn't actually alone in this trend, which I think is worth knowing. Australia's house price to rent gap currently sits at around 30.4%. That's a meaningful gap, but internationally, it's actually smaller than what's happening in countries like Turkey, Portugal, and Hungary, where that gap is even more extreme. My take on that: it doesn't make Australia's situation less real for the people living through it, but it does tell you this isn't some uniquely broken local phenomenon. It's part of a much bigger global shift in how renting and buying compare, driven largely by interest rates climbing everywhere at once. So, with all of that laid out, what's the actually smart way to think about this, instead of just picking a side based on which video you watched first? One approach worth understanding is something called rentvesting. In simple terms, that means renting in the area where you actually want to live, often because buying there is completely out of reach, while investing in property somewhere the numbers genuinely stack up. It's not the right fit for everyone, and it comes with its own risks and considerations. But it's a good example of how thinking outside that old binary, either you rent forever or you buy immediately, can open up options a lot of people never even consider. Here's my honest, practical take on all of this. The real mistake isn't renting, and it isn't buying either. The real mistake is making either decision purely based on an old cultural rule, instead of actually sitting down and running your own numbers for your own city, your own income, and your own timeline. And I want to be clear, none of this is personal financial advice. I don't know your specific situation, your income, or your goals. If you're weighing up a decision this size, it's genuinely worth speaking with a licensed financial advisor or mortgage broker who can actually look at your numbers directly. So let's bring this all together, because I know we've covered a lot of ground. This video isn't telling you renting is always better, and it's definitely not telling you to avoid buying property altogether, because in some markets right now, buying genuinely still makes sense. What it is telling you is that the old unquestioned rule, buying always beats renting, no matter where you are or what the numbers say, simply isn't true anymore, at least not universally, and definitely not right now. Here's how I'd sum up my honest take on this whole topic. A myth survives because nobody bothers to check it against current numbers. The moment you actually do the maths for your own situation in your own city right now, you stop making decisions based on what you were told growing up, and you start making decisions based on what's actually true today. If this changed how you're thinking about renting or buying, drop a comment and let me know. Are you renting right now, or did you buy? And looking at these numbers, do you think you made the right call for your situation? I read every single comment, genuinely. And if you know someone who's about to make a big decision on this, maybe feeling pressured because they think renting means they're falling behind, send this video their way. Sometimes all it takes is showing someone the actual numbers instead of the old assumption. I'll keep tracking how this rent versus buy gap moves, because depending on what happens with interest rates from here, this entire picture could shift again fairly quickly. Hit subscribe if you want honest numbers-based breakdowns like this one instead of recycled advice from a different decade. I'm Daniel, this has been Daniel Reports, and I'll see you in the next one.